In this tutorial, we're going to show you how you can utilize the Profile Toolpath to create textured wall panels using the vectors that we created in the previous tutorial. If you missed this tutorial, I have linked the video in the related videos section of the tutorial browser, so you can go ahead now and see how we created those vectors we're going to be using in this video. We're going to show you how you can change the type of texture that we're going to create by changing either the shape, size or depth of cut of the tool that we're going to start using. So let's begin by just closing this file down. And what we're going to do now is we're going to open an existing file. So I'm just going to go to open existing file. I'm going to navigate my way through the tutorials folders to the vector textures _ files folder. And in there, we're just going to open up the file that we created previously, vector _ textures _ drawing. Select that, then press open. And this will then present us with the vectors that we created in the previous tutorial. Now, before we get started on creating our toolpaths, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly just remind ourselves what we created in the previous tutorial. So I'm just going to go here to the layers list drop down. I'm just going to click that, and this will then reveal all the layers that we created previously. Now I'm just going to turn off the wood grain layer for a moment. I'm just going to quickly just remind ourselves about the cutout layer. Now this cutout layer is actually smaller than the actual job dimensions by an inch on the width and the height. Now we did this for two reasons. The first reason is when we're creating vectors, and wavy vectors especially, that go inside and outside of the actual area of the tile that we want to create, we need to also think about the fact that the tool radius, if it was going to start on the edge of here, is never going to get a full cut when going inside and outside of the actual limit, or where we're going to actually use the cutout for the tile. So to accomplish this, what we do is we create the vector texture larger than the panel that we actually want to create, and then we create a cutout pass which is smaller than the textures. So then we get a full cut effect from the tool when any of the vectors go inside and outside of that tile boundary. Now the second reason we created the cutout pass, the dimensions that we did, if we just go back onto the layers drop down, is because we created these wave vectors. Now we wanted to create a set of vectors that was basically we could use to create a repeating textured wall panel, where basically if I cut multiples of this one design here, I should be able to lay this textured wall panel from side to side, top to bottom, and the flow of the actual texture itself would flow in between and into one another perfectly. And if you want to find out more information on how we did that, you can watch the previous tutorial, which I did link in the related videos section. Now the next lot of vectors that we created were the step vectors. So you'll notice that we just basically took the same style of vectors and then just put them on an angle. And then we created these swirl vectors. If we just turn those on and turn off the step layer vectors, you'll notice that these vectors have like a swirling effect, and we've also adjusted here, as you can see, that the distance between each of the wave vectors is different. Now what we did there is we introduced some variation in the line spacing when we created those vectors. And the last lot of vectors that you saw first were the vectors that we created to try and create a wood grain. So if we just turn the swirl pattern off and turn on the wood grain, you'll notice that these are completely different to the other vectors that we created. They have a longer wavelength, they have very minimal wave amplitude, and the wave spacing itself is very tight. As you can see, it's very close together, and we also introduce a lot of noise into these waves as well. Now the reason we did this is we want to try and create the closest that we can get to a realistic wood grain effect as possible using vectors and a profile toolpath. Now what we're going to do to start with is we're going to simply create our wave vectors to begin with. So I'm just going to turn back on the visibility of the wave layer, going to turn off the visibility of the wood grain layer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this icon here to go over to the Toolpaths tab, like so. Now before creating any toolpath, it's always advisable to check your material setup. So let's just go into the material setup button here, and let's just make sure all these settings are correct. So we've got a thickness of material of 3/4 of an inch. We're going to start the machine toolpath at the lower left, and it's going to go from the material surface, And our clearance looks okay. Our home start position is at x0, y0, and the gap above the material is 0.8 of an inch. And I may just want to reduce that slightly, like so. And then when I'm happy, just press OK, and then we can get on with creating our toolpaths. Now, as I mentioned, in this tutorial we're going to solely use the profile toolpath, but we're going to come up with different types of textures by utilising the different shape of tool, the different size of tool, and different cut depths. So let's begin by selecting the vectors themselves, and then we're going to go over to the profile toolpath and click on that. And then what we're going to do is we're first of all going to select and start depth. So I'm just going to leave that at 0, so I want it to be at the top of the material, and I'm going to select a cut depth of 1/10 of an inch. So I'm just going to change that to 0.1, like so. I don't actually need to show the advanced toolpath options in this, so I can just simply uncheck this option here. And then I can go ahead and select my tool. So I'm just going to go into the tool database, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with using a 1/4 inch ball nose. So I'm just going to keep these as the defaults. Now obviously if you plan to machine any of these, do make sure the settings are correct for your machine, and then press OK, like so. Now once we've selected our tool, we're just going to choose to machine on the vectors. As you can see, that's already selected on mine. And then what we're going to do is just simply give this toolpath a name. So I'm just going to call this, so it's relative to the vectors that I'm creating the toolpath for. So I'm just going to call this wave space 0.25 BN for ball nose tool, and then I'm going to press calculate, like so. Now once the toolpath is calculated, it brings you into the preview toolpath form, and we can simply preview it from here. So I'm just going to go ahead and just preview with the defaults, as you can see there. Now you can see that this has given us quite an interesting texture. So if we just take a look closely, but you will notice that we do have like it's only small. We do have a small ridge where there's no material that's actually been machined away from the top surface of the material. Now this is all obviously to do with visual opinion. This actually does look like quite a nice texture in itself, but if we did want to get rid of those ridges where we've got flat spots basically, we would need to do one of two things. We'd need to either change the diameter of the ball nose tool itself to something larger than the actual line spacing that we created for the vectors. Now that was 0.3 of an inch, so you can see why the 1/4 inch ball nose hasn't actually been able to cut away all the material in between each of the cuts. Or secondly, we would actually go ahead and recreate those vectors with a smaller line spacing, something that would either match the diameter of the tool that we're using or smaller. So I'm just going to reset the view, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another toolpath with a larger ball nose tool. So I'm just going to go back into the profile toolpath, and this time I'm going to create this with a 1/2 inch ball nose, like so. And then I'm simply just going to give this a name of wave 0.5 BN and press calculate, keeping all the options the same as they are remembered from the last time I created a toolpath, like so. And then all I need to do is just reset my preview, and if I wanted to, I can actually change the material to something that may give a better view. Let's say cherry. Let's press preview on that. Now you'll see this time that we have no ridges left where there's no material that's been cut away from the top surface of the material, and this actually does give a different style of vector texture effect, as you can see. Now the next vectors that we're going to actually machine, so if I just press close on this, and if you just go back into the 2D view, is the step vectors. So I'm just going to hide the visibility of the wave layer, turn on the step layer, like so, make sure that's the active level, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to again just select those vectors and to go back into the profile toolpath. Now this time I'm going to use a different tool again, so I'm going to use a V-bit tool this time. I'm going to use a 90-degree V-bit, like so, and I'm going to specify a slightly deeper cut depth, just so we get more of a fuller pattern from the tool itself. Just going to put that down to 0.15 like so, and then I'm just going to rename this step V90 like so, and then press calculate, and then I can reset the preview there, and then I can preview this toolpath like so, and you'll see that you do get quite a different and more dramatic effect from using a V-bit tool. And if we just zoom in there, you'll notice that again that we are suffering from having flat spots on the corners. Now, there are two ways we can actually solve this issue. We can, because obviously the tool diameter is 1/2 inch on this V-bit tool, and the wave spacing is only 0.3 of an inch. The actual tool itself is very capable of cutting away all of the surface of that. So we have two options. The first option would be to obviously cut deeper with the tool. So I'll just go ahead and do that. I'm just going to double click on this toolpath, and then I'm just going to change this depth to 0.2 of an inch like so, and then just recalculate that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to preview that toolpath again, and you'll see that that has now got rid of those flat spots on there. The other thing we can do is, if we didn't want to cut any deeper into the materials, we could use a wider angled V-bit tool. So if I'm just going to undo that so you can still see the previous results, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the profile toolpath, and this time I'm going to keep the same cut depth, but I'm going to use a wider angled tool. Now at the moment I don't have a 120 degree V-bit tool, so I'm just going to simply create one. So I'm just going to press copy, and it's going to change that to 120 like so, and this is also going to go to 120 degrees, and then I'm just going to click apply, and then it's going to warn me about that the pass depth is greater than the tool's maximum cutting depth, and it gives you the maximum pass depth for the tool. So simply just take that and put that in here, and you can press apply and OK. And then all we need to do is simply just rerun that toolpath. So first of all, I'm just going to give it a name again. So step V120, calculate, preview, and you'll notice that that again has solved the problem where we now no longer have any flat spots affecting that texture, like so. Next, we're going to move on and take a look at some vectors where we're going to actually adjust, or have adjusted, the line spacing in between each of the vectors and see what effect that has on the texture that we can toolpath. So let's just come out of the preview toolpath form, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into 2D view, in the layers drop down, I'm going to turn on the swirl layer, turn off the step layer, like so, and you'll see straight away that the line spacing does vary in between each of these vectors. So just make sure that those are selected like so, and then we're going to go into the profile toolpath, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a 90 degree V-bit for this to begin with, like so. Keep the same cutting depth. We're going to machine on those vectors, and we're just going to call this swirl V90 like so. Press calculate and just reset that preview, and then preview that toolpath. Now you'll notice by adding the line variation we've got a completely different type of texture here, and we do get a really nice effect from this, as each of the line, dependent on their line spacing, cuts into one another dependent on the distance from the next line. So we get this difference in the height of peaks, giving us like this 2.5D toolpath type effect, and this does look really nice. Now again, you can see that there are some flat spots, and that would get removed if we were to change the cut depth of that toolpath. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually try this vector texture with a ball nose tool. So let's close the preview, and what we're going to do is just go back into the profile toolpath. I'm going to change that depth a little, change the tool to a 1/2 inch ball nose like so, and just come down and give this a name of swirl 0.5 BN like so. Calculate and just preview that, and you get a much shallower effect from using a ball nose when you get this type of crossover effect, but still a very nice texture panel that we could produce by utilizing that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to our last vector texture, which is our wood grain. So I'm just going to come out of here and it's going to turn on the wood grain layer like so, and in the 2D view just make sure that we select our vectors and then head over to the profile toolpath. So let's go into that, and we're going to change the cut depth here to make it a little more shallow to 0.05, and then we're going to choose another ball nose tool, but this time, due to the line space in between the lines in our wood grain vector, we're going to choose a smaller tool. We're going to choose an 1/8 inch ball nose for this, and then just going to select that and just call this wood grain 0.125 ball nose, like so. Calculate that, reset and preview, and you'll see that we're left with quite a nice natural looking wood grain from the 1/8 inch ball nose tool there. Now you'll notice that in some areas we do have some flat spots, and that's because in those particular areas there the gaps were actually larger than the 1/8 inch diameter tool. Now that can add to the effect, as you can see it does act quite nicely here, but another way if we wanted to actually get rid of any of those flat spots would be literally just to increase the size of the tool, so we can do that. So I'm just going to quickly just change this to a 1/4 inch ball nose. It all depends on obviously the type of wood grain texture that we're after. So if we're after quite like a punchy wood grain, you'd have something like this, or even you might even try a V-bit tool, which we're going to try in just a moment. So I'm just going to call this wood grain 0.25 like so, and just calculate that, and just reset and preview like so. Now you'll see we have a softer type natural looking wood grain. That's because obviously the 1/4 inch tool is able to cut away the majority of that material in between each of the line spaces. Now if we wanted to get something a bit more sharper, we can use the V-bit tool. So if I just go back into the profile toolpath, and I'm just going to change the depth of this to 0.1, and just going to use a 90° 1/2 inch V-bit, and just call this wood grain V90 like so, and then just going to reset and preview that. And you'll see with a V-bit wood grain, you'll notice that we end up with a nice sharp edges, and we do actually get quite a nice looking wood grain from this. As I say, like, dependent on the type of work that you're doing, depends on the different type of tool that you would use to create the wood grain. But all are very nice and very easy to accomplish with a CNC. So the only thing left to do now would be to create the profile cutout pass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the preview toolpath form. I'm going to go into the 2D view. I'm just going to hide the wood grain, as it's going to make it harder to select the cutout pass. And I'm just going to select that cutout pass, go to the profile toolpath, and in the cut depth I'm just going to type in Z and the equals key. It's going to bring up thickness of the material. I'm going to choose a end mill of 1/4 inch like so, and I'm going to run the tool on the outside of the vectors. I'm going to call this cut out like so, calculate that, and then I can use this cutout pass on any of the textures that we've created, as they're all equal size. And if I do that, you can simply then just double click the wastage material away to get the actual full final preview of the product that we'd create. Now if I just reset the preview and go back to one of the earlier ones, like the wave, like so, and you'll see that down here we have those incomplete areas where the radius of the tool hasn't actually gone far enough to actually complete the actual pattern that you're supposed to create. And this is why we decided that we were going to create the cutout and overcut all the textures outside of the actual panel area that we actually wanted to create. So now if I create the cutout pass and just preview that, double click the wastage, if I zoom in, you notice that now we have complete cuts around all the edges of our panel like so. And that really does bring this tutorial to a close. There is another tutorial after this where we look into the same vector texture patterns that we've created, and we now apply 2.5D type toolpaths and look how varying the actual height of each of the lines can give us a different type of vector texture as well. So that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.